unless you're a platform engineer, setting up CI/CD pipelines are just so not fun. Um, Somehow I've ended up having to do it a couple of times. Um, this recent project I started working on was a monolith, and previously we were doing deployments by just literally running commands in our CLI, which obviously isn't really sustainable if one dev is basically having to take a whole day trying to do the deployment. So I ended up having to set up a CI/CD pipeline, which now means that we can do deployments really, really easy. Um, and I'll kind of just walk you through some of the fundamentals for setting things up. So really, it kind of starts off with the CI part. Why am I in that? The CI part, which is the continuous. I can't spell integration. So this is just getting your code shared into getting your code merged into a shared repository, which most most people are just using Git now right now with version control. So that will be with, chances are that's also on GitHub. All your code is hosted there. Um, so what you'll probably do is you'll have some kind of base branch, either main or master. I don't really know anyone that uses master anymore, but main, let's say. And then what you'll do is you'll branch off, you'll create your feature branch, some call feature. You'll do your work, you'll add your commits, right? Um, all that fun stuff. But now getting it back into main, you'll have to create a pull request, which depending on your team size, um, it might just be a couple of the devs. I've been at places where there's been a big team, so you would need a couple approvals. So two approvals needed, or if it's a smaller team, then just one approval. Or you might not even require approvals. I'm not sure you should do that, but probably should have. Just definitely have devs taking a look at it at the very least. Now, during this process, what you can do is um, add in some linting or formatting when someone pushes their code. So, I mean, this is kind of like a contested topic of when or if you should even lint, like, sorry, not lint, sorry, use the pre-commit hooks or pre-push. So you'll kind of configure this with Husky. Husky will let you hook into these hooks and then run a certain script, which might be to run your linting or formatting. Now, if your devs don't really want to be slowed down during committing and pushing, which obviously is very fine, you will want to do this at the pull request stage. So in the pull request, what you can do is have GitHub Actions run every time you create a pull request, or on push. So you'll pick a branch, whether that's main, master, or staging, or dev, or whatever, and then when you push some code into that branch, you can run some code. I mean, GitHub Actions, there's a lot you can do, but in a pull request, for example, the first thing you would probably do is install packages, and then you would build, make sure your code runs. You'd also lint code, if I can spell, format, just because you'll obviously have a bunch of people working on the same code and you kind of need uniformity. It can happen where you'll merge code and then the only change is the formatting code. That's just because your prettier config, or I mean, obviously if you're using TypeScript, it'll be prettier. or Biome now. I've never actually used Biome, but it'll be something like that. You can actually run your tests as well here. So I'm not really a huge testing person, but it's just been that my work hasn't really been in a place where testing the code has to be like absolutely perfect. Even then, you kind of need to be in like a testing mindset to write tests. And since most of my work has just been writing web services and APIs, half the test would just be creating mocks. So I'm not really pro test, but if you do have tests, you would probably run them here. And then this will kind of give you a good, also I guess if you're doing TypeScript or some kind of type language, you'd run some kind of type check here as well. So this happens in the pull request, and now your coworkers are happy with it. It's approved, and now the code gets merged into main. Actually, let's take a step back. So with deployment, I guess that kind of comes into the CD. There's a few ways to kind of get your code live. Ideally, you want multiple environments, so you might have a dev environment. These are live environments that you can access by some kind of URL, whether that's dev.myapplication.com, and then it might be one for staging, and then obviously the one for production. That is actually what I can't spell today or ever, I guess. And then there might be one for production. So what you would want to do is, there's a few ways to do it. You can either have trunk based, I mean, I'm sure there's more ways, but the main ways to do it is trunk based, or you can do git flow. Now what trunk based means is that you'll have your feature branch and you'll merge code back into main, and then this will automatically deploy to your dev branch. Wow, that was a horrible arrow. And then if you want to merge code into staging, you'd have some kind of other workflow that you will give it a commit. You'll give that a commit, and then that commit, it can be a commit or a tag or some kind of placeholder, I guess, or for that deployment to know which version of the code to deploy. And then same thing for production. Now this part also can be automated. If you're at a really big enterprise, you might have end-to-end tests run, and then if those tests pass, then it will automatically deploy to next stage. So in that sense, you just merge to main, and then slowly the code will just make it through all the environments. Generally speaking, you probably still want to have a manual step. When doing a prod deploy, just because it's prod, you wanna protect prod to a different level. Whereas git flow, you'll have a branch for each one. So if, for example, you have these 3 staging environments, you have dev branch, you'll have a staging branch, and then you'll have a prod branch. So what you'll do is you'll branch, if you're doing a feature request or you're working on a feature, you will branch off of off of dev. You'll do your change, and then you'll merge back into dev, and then from dev you'll create a PR that merges dev to staging, and then that's how you will get code into staging. And then the same thing from staging to prod. So you'll just create a PR, and that's how you get into production. So that's the Git flow, and then trunk based. And then with trunk based, you're probably, because you're just sending basically all of your code into a single branch, and you're kind of just sending. You might have unfinished code. What you'll end up doing is using some call tech like feature flags to hide unfinished features or just stuff you don't want to release. So that's what you would use feature flags for. Where was I? So we've done CI, CD, and then also when at the end of this GitHub action, so this is kind of just to test your code. What we can actually do at the end of that is to do a deploy to your staging environment. Actually, you won't do that there. I'm wrong. Once the code has been merged, depending on if you do trunk based or Git flow, you will have another action. I say action because that's just what I've used in the past. You might have some other workflow tool, depending on the size of your company. But obviously, if you have a bigger company, you probably have a whole dedicated DevOps team to do all this. This is more so you kind of just need to get it done. Because in my situation, I didn't really have any other choice. Kind of just had to figure out a way to do it and do it. So this is very much so more of a bare bones setup. And then this will do a deploy to staging. So this is what we kind of have is we branch off of main to do the feature. And then when we merge back into, actually no, that's a lie. Let me start again. So we branch off staging to do a feature. And then we put it back into staging. And then what this will do is triggers a deploy. And then that goes to our staging environment, and our staging environment basically has all of our services running. So we have our gateway, and then we have a bunch of microservices with GraphQL, and then we also have a cron job service, and just a normal HTTP service as well that listens for webhooks. And then we have some full stack apps. Now imagine working on something and then having to do a manual deploy. This is kind of why CI/CD pipelines are great, because you can work on your code, you can merge your code, and then you can just deploy it. And now kind of what happens is once that's in staging and we want to deploy it to prod, we currently do Git flow. So staging is through the staging environment, and then once we're happy for it to go to main, go to prod. We make sure all the environment variables are there, if anything's been added, all the kind of sanity checks. And then we kind of just we create a PR that does staging to prod to main. And then we do a manual deploy. which actually deploys the code. We actually use Fly, so which is containers and long ring servers to do deploys. So it's not serverless. So with our full stack apps, it's really nice because the API routes kind of just, it's basically just an Express server running on the side, right? So it's not too difficult. Just to that side. And for our GraphQL services, we use Apollo. So in our deploy, we also need to know if it's a GraphQL. If it's a GraphQL service, we need to check if there's any schema changes. And then because we're also using microservices and it's a subgraph, and then all of the microservices come together to make a supergraph. We have to, if there are schema changes, we have to do a deploy to the supergraph so it knows that there's been a schema change. If you don't know too much about GraphQL, count yourself lucky. Don't get into it, it's a pain. Anyways, so our deployments will go out to Fly, and that's basically the end of the CI/CD pipeline. So just to recap, I'll just kind of go over here if it lets me zoom in. So you get a task come in, you branch off staging, and then you do your work. You create a pull request. Merge PR into staging, and then this does a staging deploy depending on which services you changed. That'll do a staging deploy, and then if you want that also to go to production, you have to create git flow for prod, and then once it's in main, you do a manual deploy. So the manual deploy is actually another GitHub action, which works off a GitHub action dispatch. What was it? Workflow dispatch. So it's basically going into GitHub, going to the action, finding the action, and then giving it a tag and the base branch and which service it is. So you pick the base branch, pick tag, and then pick a service or app, basically. So then for each application or service, you have to do an individual deploy. Because it's prod, it's fine to be a bit more manual. This tag is actually created when we do a staging deploy. So we have an action called releases. And what that actually does is it creates, it creates a tag, it bumps the services version, And then it changes the adds to the changelog. So what this will do is it takes your commits and then it creates changelog from commits. And then also based on these commits, it will bump the version. So if it's a feature, so we use semvar. So if it's a feature, it will do a minor bump. If it's a chore, it'll do a patch bump. I've yet to do something that does a major bump, so I'm not too sure if we would get to that point, but that is, oops. Oh. That's something to discover when we get to it. Okay. What else? What else? That's basically it, to be honest. So we have the releases action, and going forwards, what would be really nice to add is tests. So even though I'm not a huge testing person, it would be nice to add in some more tests to run. Better or stricter type checking. So really the main thing is the deployment. Where you kind of really want to automate is the deployment part. That is the biggest headache. And this is why people will use Vercel or something, where you can just kind of merge to a branch and it will go to Vercel and it will create a preview as well for you. And that's because they're using serverless, so for them preview deployments are really, really easy and cheap and practically free. Because if you don't use the preview, then there's not really any cost to them. But if you do, then it's nice. We can do that with Fly. But it's just really painful to set up. So we don't really have it set up. We also use a PlanetScale for our database, so we don't really have to worry about migrations or anything. But if you do have migrations, it will probably go into one of these actions here. So on migration. So depending on if you do migrations, currently we use PlanetScale. So for us, it's creating a PR in PlanetScale and doing it that way rather than running migrations, which is really, really nice. And that's basically it. So the bare minimum that you really should be doing is on a PR, running some kind of build, running your build, running some kind of basic type checking. Linting and formatting are kind of long. Linting, formatting, testing is kind of like a stretch goal. That's just for PRs, and then when you actually do a deploy, you obviously want to do the deploy. There's a lot to do with that as well. I mean, we also actually have blue-green deploys. So what that means is you don't want the old service to go down. So what it actually will do is spins up extra machines those new machines have the new code, and then that new code runs, and Fly itself will check if it's actually running. You have to give it some like health check endpoints. That's how it knows if the machine is healthy and running. And then once the new machines are running properly, then it will tear down the old machines. And then all traffic routed to routed. Oh my god, those are great arrows, but you get the point. Did a terrible arrow again. You get the point. So really, the point is that you don't get any downtime with this. You have extra machines that kind of run and test their new code, and then if they break, then they're just taken down. But if they work, then the old machines are taken down, and then all your new traffic is just pointed to their new green machines, which is amazing. So once you've deployed to staging, you deploy to production, and you're basically at the end of the pipeline. Happy days. Fun stuff, huh? There's a lot to it. GitHub Actions, CI/CD pipelines are a real pain to set up and get going, but once they get going, you have a huge weight off your shoulders and things just work, which is why, like I said, people just use Vercel to do their deploys, because deploys are really the annoying part. Running builds and type checks and tests locally is fine, but doing the actual deploy is really the hard part. So if you just want to save yourself time, just use Vercel or some other platform that kind of helps you do that. Whether that's Vercel, Railway. Fly still requires a bunch of setup, so it's not as easy as Vercel or Railway. But if you do have more time and you want to use machines, because Fly is really, really cheap. Like, you're not just they do like VM stuff. It's not just a container on. I mean, I think they are moving to like containers or something, but they're VMs. So somehow it's much, much cheaper to run a machine on Fly than it would be an equivalent on like EC2 or some kind of other VPS. So Fly is really, really cheap. So that's a bonus. But yeah, that's the end.